Yeah, absolutely. Well, you and I were going to get together. I hoped, and then the virus hit.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to talk about. Our common interest in the 8th and so.
I just bought your Richard Campbell book online. We're headed out on vacation. I won't get it till I come back, but eager to read it.
It's a quick one. It's a real quick one.
We are live right now on Emerging Revolutionary War. Thank you everybody for coming and checking us out. I'm Mark Malloy, and I'm being joined tonight by Gabe Neville, who is the author of the 8th Virginia blog. If you haven't checked that out, definitely go check that blog out. A lot of good information about the 8th Virginia Regiment. And also by Michael Cessair, who's joining us from Williamsburg, Virginia, in his colonial tavern that he's living there, where we should be having all of our emerging Revolutionary War happy hours.
Absolutely.
But yeah, tonight we have a great topic we're going to be talking about. General Peter Muhlenberg, and we'll also be talking about the 8th Virginia. Mike just published a book, just came out about a month ago, about Peter Muhlenberg, his life, which is one of the first biographies, I believe, on him in quite a long time. So it's some nice praise on the back here as well.
That's right. Thank you for that, Mark.
But yeah, no, and me and Mike go way back. We were just talking before we got started that one of my passions to get into Revolutionary War was through reenacting, and Mike's the captain of the 7th Virginia Regiment of the Continental Line, which does awesome job reenacting and doing living history all across the country. You should definitely check them out as well. And yeah, no, I remember going and watching him reenacting and really wanting to be a part of it, and joined up with the 7th. And this year's reenactments have been pretty limited because of COVID, but hopefully get back out in the field sometime soon.
Mark, I was just bragging to my wife how the 7th made you who you are. You became a reenactor, and now you're a park ranger. I went to William and Mary. You probably would have gone there anyway, but went to William and Mary, and have a passion for history. So we want to take some credit for that.
Oh yeah, we definitely get a lot of that credit. That's for sure. But yeah, no. So we want to hear a little bit about, if you want to tell the viewers a little bit about the book. I guess this is what number book is this for you, Mike?
This is my 16th book.
He's been writing for quite a long time, and honestly, watching him publish books while doing reenactments and things like that, reading those books really also got me interested in wanting to write. And Mike was also gracious enough to write the foreword to my book, Victory or Death, about Trenton and Princeton. So
I'm guessing you're working on something new, because you get bit by the bug, you just can't stop. What are you working on anything?
Yeah, no, I'm actually working right now on one about Charleston, South Carolina during the Revolutionary War.
Oh, we may have to talk then. Well, the whole thing, the whole 8 years or so, or beyond that?
Mostly 8 years, but focusing mainly on Sullivan's Island in 76 and then the siege in 1780. And similar to the other Emerging Revolutionary War series, it's focused a lot on places you can go visit. So it'll have different locations in both those areas that you can actually see where some of the history took place. And obviously the 8th Virginia was involved at Sullivan's Island. 76, all Virginians were down there, unfortunately, in 1780 as well, mostly captured there. But anyway, so this is book number 16 for you. So what made you want to look into writing about Peter Muhlenberg?
Muhlenberg, there are a couple of factors, and the first one that pops to mind is simply there were books on the other 3 Virginia brigadier generals from the 77, 78 time period. One of my first Rev War books I ever read was about George Whedon. I forget Harry, I forgot his name now. It's embarrassing. Ward wrote that, I believe, in the late Harry Ward wrote that. And it was a fascinating account of Whedon. Then I knew there was one on General Scott that again, he wrote. And then I wrote one on William Woodford, who's not a popular character by any stretch to anyone except for me. And I liked him because he commanded the brigade that the 7th and the 11th Virginia was in. So and he died in the war. So I wanted to do a book on him. So once I had done mine on Woodford and the other two were done, all of a sudden it's like, well, General Muhlenberg, he's the most famous of them all. Anyway, what's out there on him? And I couldn't find much. You're absolutely right. There was something in the 1950s or so that was written. And of course, the main source was one that was written 75 years after the Revolution by his great nephew or something, which has a lot of good primary source information in it, but also a lot of legend and lore. So I started digging a little bit, and I'm like, because this guy, the guy's name comes up. You mentioned the Virginia line got captured at Charleston, but he didn't go. He refused to go because he didn't want to serve under William Woodford. There was a big to-do about rank. So he's in Virginia, left to pick up the pieces. He's pretty much the only one. I mean, George Whedon had resigned in protest, but Muhlenberg had stuck through it. So when I started digging about Muhlenberg, I started finding some great stuff. For instance, what jumps out at me is he could be anybody. He could be anybody. I mean, the guy was first generation American, German born in Pennsylvania. As in his adolescent years, his father, who is a very important Lutheran minister, moves the family to Philadelphia, and his son starts getting in trouble, hanging out. I wrote it down. I wanted to use the quote. It was quite funny, but he's hanging out with kind of the wrong sort of people, right? He just couldn't get in trouble hanging around the city teenagers that are idle. So he decides to send his. Of course, I can't find the quote. He decides to send his son Peter and his two other sons over to Germany. Now Peter gets apprenticed for 6 years as a grocer, and at first he thinks this is going to be it. He's just going to be a grocer. Think about that for a second. He's 16, 17 years old, and he writes later on that he learned in 4 weeks everything he needed to know about that trade and wasn't interested in it, but he was signed up for 6 years. And so needless to say, after a couple of years of being somewhat exploited, he starts to get antsy and he wants out. And his father finds out about it, and you have to negotiate because the person that is training him has also essentially signed a contract to do so. So they have to renegotiate, and his father agrees to pay some money to shorten the duration of basically the indenture. And then Muhlenberg jumped ship, literally jumped ship. He gets an opportunity to join the 60th Royal American Regiment, which is recruiting in Germany. It's basically a German regiment working for the British, being garrisoned in America. So he's going to use that as a reason to go home. And he joins up. Now, this is the important part, because that's the extent of his military experience right there, being essentially the regimental secretary for the trip across the ocean. That's it. In 1766, I think it is. He's 20 years old now. So he gets home. His father's furious at him, but still pays off his debts, and he's discharged from the regiment. And now he's kind of adrift, and he ends up following Dad's footsteps. Remember, he's the oldest son. So he ends up preaching himself, and he's good at it. He's really good at it. And before you know it, he captures the attention of a gentleman out of Colonel Wood out of Frederick County, who's looking for basically a bilingual minister, someone who can speak German and English for Beckford Parish, which is in what is now Shenandoah County, but back then it was Dunmore County. And the catch was that Muhlenberg had to be ordained in the Anglican Church because it was the established church in Virginia. So he agrees. He goes over, checks it out, likes what he sees, goes across to England, gets ordained in England, comes back to now Virginia with his wife. He's newly married, and kind of takes over the church. That's 1772. Within a couple of years, he is essentially chairing the committee meetings in that county, in Dunmore County. That's how prominent he is. And then by 1776, he's attending the 4th Virginia Convention, and he's chosen to command the 8th Virginia. Now, the guy's 29 years old, has almost no military experience to speak of, but there must have been something about his character. And now I've been rambling on. This is where Gabe comes in because he's the expert on the 8th Virginia. But I just find, so far the story's already got me, and that's just the beginning before the military stuff, which is always the cool stuff.
Mark, you want me to just pick up from there?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So Peter's, he's the rector of Beckford Parish. Some people say that he's got a dual ordination, that he's a Lutheran and an Anglican preacher. He's not. There's no evidence he was ever ordained in the Lutheran Church. So he's an Anglican. And theologically, there's not a whole lot of difference. And as I like to say, the king himself was German, right? So there wasn't that much controversy associated with switching from one to the other. But as Mike said, so he ends up chairing the county committee, or as we usually call them now, the Committee of Safety. He actually wrote the Dunmore Resolves, responding to the Boston boycott movement. It closely mirrored the Frederick County Resolves, which were written by Charles Minthruston, who was another fighting pastor from Winchester, just to the north. And then he comes back from the Virginia Convention with a commission or an announced commission, and his job is to put together a whole new regiment. So just a minute about the regiment. So if you read the popular narrative about Muhlenberg's farewell sermon and how the 8th Virginia Regiment was recruited, there's a picture of this behind Mark, by the way, a very ahistorical picture there. He was probably wearing a hunting shirt, by the way.
I was good. So, I thought the same thing when I saw it.
So the story goes that he comes back and he's a colonel, and he gives just a barn-burning sermon from Ecclesiastes, which ends with there's a time for peace and a time for war, and boys, it's time for war. Let's go fight. And he takes off his black cloak, and underneath there's a colonel's uniform, and all the men shout, and suddenly he's got 680 guys enlisted, right? Well, that's not how it happened.
Exactly.
He probably gave the sermon, and Mike, by the way, I got to give you kudos. You were the first person in history to write sort of a historical, careful, almost certainly accurate depiction of how the sermon actually went.
Thank you.
And you read the source materials carefully, and you produced actual history as opposed to whatever else we've had in the past. So the way the regiment was actually recruited is at the beginning of the war in Virginia, counties were given assignments for recruiting. Every county in Virginia had to recruit either 1 or 2 companies, and they weren't even assigned to regiments yet. They just had to recruit 1 or 2 companies depending on their population. The 8th Virginia had 10 companies raised in 8 different counties. Dunmore County raised 2 of them. The Virginia Convention had this interesting notion that maybe they could form a German regiment. Because on the far side of the Blue Ridge, there were a lot of Germans who had come there from Pennsylvania. Almost none of them came overland from Tidewater, Virginia. Almost all of them came from Pennsylvania. And so they weren't really culturally Virginian. Their religion was different. Their ethnicity was different. A lot of them didn't even speak English. But the Virginia Convention wanted them to fight. They were good marksmen, and they were able-bodied. And if they could get them literally enlisted into the effort, it would be a good thing. So they had this notion of forming a German regiment. The committee of the Commonwealth Committee of Safety, the Virginia Committee of Safety, assigned these 10 companies from 8 different counties to the 8th. Now, they came from a very broad swath of the Virginia frontier, stretching all the way from Fort Pitt or Pittsburgh, which at the time was considered to be part of Virginia, at least by Virginians, all the way down to essentially not quite the Cumberland Gap, more like the Holston River settlements, the New River settlements. So this actually goes a little bit into North Carolina. People didn't quite know where the line was. So that's several hundred miles. There is no way that Peter Muhlenberg personally recruited all of these people through one sermon, right?
Within a week of him being, or 2 weeks of being
right.
appointed.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, and the rendezvous, more to the point, was in Suffolk, Virginia. So right. it wasn't until the following spring in Suffolk that a lot of these people even met each other. But Dunmore County was sort of the heart and soul of it, right? You know, Peter Muhlenberg was from there. The Lieutenant Colonel Abraham Bowman, who was even younger, I think he was 28 years old. He was from Dunmore County. The major was Peter Helfenstein, who was from Winchester. All three of them are German. So all of the field officers were German. I have a theory that I have yet to be able to prove, that the convention didn't really care if the regiment was all German. They just wanted Germans in charge, because the other people in the regiment were Irish. No offense, Mark. No offense, Mark. These were what we would call today Scotch Irish, right? So they were Presbyterians. Presbyterianism was synonymous with sort of nonconformism and rebelliousness at the time. I think the Virginia Convention just really, really wanted the Germans in charge if there was going to be a frontier regiment. But even Dunmore County had two companies, one led by Jonathan Clark, who was George Rogers Clark's brother, William Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition, their older brother. He led the German company from Dunmore County. Richard Campbell, about whom Mike has written another book, he led the so-called English company from Dunmore County. So even in Dunmore County, there wasn't, it wasn't just Germans. So at any rate, so they finally rendezvoused in Suffolk in the spring. Their first job was capturing slaves who were trying to escape to Lord Dunmore's floating city of Tory refugees. When Charles Lee showed up in town, he insisted that they relocate Tories from the seaboard to get them away from a position where they could help Dunmore. So they were given that very unpleasant job.
Forced evacuation, right?
Yeah, and then word showed up that word came that the British were headed south towards Cape Fear. Turned out they were headed to Charleston, and Charles Lee, who was I think by then the second ranking general in the entire Continental Army after Washington, he looked around and said, "Okay, we're going to have to head south. Who am I taking with me?" And he finds that the 8th Virginia is the best equipped, most complete regiment in the Virginia line, and says, "Okay, you guys are coming with me." And they headed south. I might hand off to, I don't know, Mark, you used to be a park ranger down there and you're writing a book about Sullivan's Island. Why don't you tell us what happens next?
Well, I mean, I always thought it was amazing because, growing up in Virginia and, having been out to Woodstock, and hearing the story, you go there today at Woodstock and they have two statues there and describe his famous taking off the cloak, which I actually was able to reenact for the town on a couple occasions, perpetuating the myth. So,
but no, we want to make sure though. There's a lot of it that's absolutely true. I think. I mean, there's no doubt that he gave a sermon that inspired people. The details are where I think they fudge. For instance, the artist in the background behind you painted a Continental officer, right? But he didn't realize that in 1776, the uniform of Virginia's officers, I mean, you see it in their orderly books, is a hunting shirt with a sash.
And they weren't Continentals yet.
They don't, exactly. They don't become Continentals for a while longer. And the other thing, as Gabe rightly pointed out, was it's the timing. The timing just does not make sense. It assumes that he went out and recruited everybody. And that wasn't even his responsibility. That was the responsibility. They actually, you see it in Henning's statutes. If you are a captain, if you've been chosen by your county to be a captain, then you have to recruit a certain quota of men. And then the lieutenant has to do the same thing, and the ensign has to do the same thing. Those are the guys that went out there and signed everybody up. So I've always, and when you dig deep and you find out, well, where was the source of this? Where did this story come from? And it looks like it really it took traction from his nephew, his great nephew, who wrote the biography of him. but you find other accounts. The one I kind of relied on, I was warned by others lately, don't put too much credence in who is it? Thatcher. I want to say Thayer for some reason. And but he describes this detail where he's at essentially an officers gathering, and then he tells the story about how it's very not very well detailed, but he tells a story about Muhlenberg being a minister who gave a sermon and then marched, and then he says it, and then he led 300 men, east or something like that. So I'm convinced it was basically a farewell sermon in March, and then he marched with some of the companies that formed there. But I agree with Gabe too that some of them I'm not going to go all the way up to Woodstock if I'm down in Pontotoc County. My muster point is Suffolk. I'm going that way. I'm not going to double my distance. So that's my theory. And
I completely agree with that, Mike.
What's that?
I completely agree with that. And I think that 300 is actually a plausible number. Mm-hmm. If you add it up a certain way, right? So each company had 68 enlisted guys, exactly. plus company officers. Yep. And Dunmore by itself had 2 companies, right? And you could see that Hampshire County, just to the west, what's now West Virginia, they might have hooked up with them there, right? Yeah, so what's that add up to? And then Frederick County might have joined them.
Yeah.
Right. Even Culpeper might have, right?
Right.
So it's entirely plausible that there were about 300 guys there for that event that day.
Right.
And I also think that that Henry A. Muhlenberg account, if you read it just like really carefully, I mean, he's clearly proud of his great uncle, right?
Of course.
And he wants this to be a big deal, and he's definitely passing on some sort of family lore. But if you read it really carefully, I think it's a little bit more factual in some ways than it appears.
Okay.
Like it lends itself to being romantic. But if you read, for instance, the notion that he had on his cloak, like his pastor's cloak or whatever you call it, and then at the end of the sermon, he took it off and his uniform was there. Well, I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But I don't think he was hiding his uniform. I mean, as you and I agree, everybody knows he's the colonel already. I think he was wearing the cloak as a matter of propriety. He's in the pulpit.
Right. Giving his last.
So and his great nephew, he doesn't say one way or the other. He just says he took off the cloak.
Right.
So I don't think it was this big dramatic surprise when he took the cloak off. I think he just had the cloak on because he was preaching. Right. Yep. So I think if you read that account carefully. Now there's another account, and this is the Thomas Buchanan Reed version, which is really doesn't pretend to be historical, but it's the one that captured everybody's imagination, right? So in like the 1850s, I think, this is the guy who wrote Sheridan's Ride, right? These epic poems about American history. Another one was called The Wagoner of the Alleghenies, right? And this is a Revolutionary War epic poem that is, as we would describe it today, based on actual events, right? So he places this story actually in the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania, but it is very closely based on Henry Muhlenberg's account of his great uncle, right?
Right.
And he had professional actors that would travel from town to town and read this poem out loud, right? So this was like as in the 1850s, it told, it was the narrative of the Revolutionary War, just as maybe Turn was 3 years ago, right? I mean, it was where everybody kind of learned about the revolution.
About as accurate too.
Yeah, about as accurate, exactly right. And it became so entrenched in American culture that McGuffey's readers, where every kid learned how to read.
Yeah.
The account of the Muhlenberg sermon, not mentioning him by name, but the pastor who became the colonel and gave the dramatic
the fighting
Ecclesiastes, and the whole story's in there, right in McGuffey's readers. So every American kid for decades read this story.
Sure.
It's no wonder that this slightly inaccurate version is so entrenched in people's minds.
And we see a version of it in the movie The Patriot in 2000 when the minister comes and takes care of his flock, fight off the wolves.
Yeah, no, that's right, exactly right.
Yeah, I wonder if it's partly to this kind of belief to show God is on our side type thing. So the
righteous cause.
Really, thing is just, I mean, during this time period, how religious people were what played a much more important role in their lives. It played, you know, something like that would be symbolically just having a minister going off to fight. I think meant a lot to people too.
I'm still more fascinated with his age, though. I just think, I mean, I know 29-year-olds, and I just don't see many of them unless they're like been trained through the army, you know, to just take them off the street and say, you're in charge of 700 men, go fight. Oh, my Lord. My kids are almost that age. No.
And, well, and what I was saying before, you know, having grown up in this area, seeing Woodstock, and the geography of all of this is just fascinating to me too. As Gabe was mentioning, people coming from Pittsburgh, marching, you know, by foot over to, Suffolk, Virginia, and then down to South Carolina. All these guys going down to South Carolina is just, walking around in the shoes they would have been wearing. It's hard to imagine.
They didn't want to go either. There's that great quote from Lee, that letter, the excerpt from General Lee complaining about these good for nothing Virginians. Mm-hmm. But then he later on, after the battle, he kind of pays him a compliment, which I've never quite understood. Because from what I saw, I don't think they played a big role. They were ready to play a big role. Yeah. But I think most of the fighting was the fort, and then the infantry that were in position to defend, but they didn't really even have to do that.
Let me say something about that, Mike. If you read the pension applications for these guys, so, you know, the story of Sullivan's Island is all about Fort Moultrie. Sure. On that day, it was called Fort Sullivan, if Mark doesn't correct me. That's where all the action was, right? That's where the British ships were pounding their cannons. Yeah. But the British had, I'm forgetting the numbers. I think they had 3,000 infantry up on what was called Long Island now.
Right.
Now it's Isle of Palms, and they were going to cross the Breach Inlet and attack. James Thompson, I think, was the South Carolina. What was he? I think he was state troops, and I don't think he was militia or continental. I think they were like state troops.
South Carolina.
North End. They fought off the amphibious assault that was coming from Long Island, but there are several 8th Virginia veterans who, in their applications, claim to have been there for this.
And the fighting.
I got them kind of earmarked, and I need to kind of compile them and reconcile them and see how it all works. But it appears to me that about 100 men, or about 3 companies, which would add up to different numbers, volunteered or were detached under Major Helfenstein to go assist.
That would make more sense, because I mean, I couldn't understand why Lee would pay him such a good compliment. I mean, he really did. And I knew that it sounded like they were on the mainland ready to cross, but it wasn't clear to me that any of them got across. But also, again, the years of doing this, you start to realize that you might start out with 600, 700 men in Virginia. By the time they got to South Carolina and Charleston in June, they probably were down to 100 men. You mentioned 100 effectives.
And by September, October, after they got bit by mosquitoes, they were down even further.
Yeah, I think
down to Georgia.
About how mosquito, killed off so many of those guys. More of them died from that than really.
Yeah, the major ended up getting sick and dying, coming home and dying.
Yeah, when they left Charleston after the battle on August 5th, and they had to leave 147 men behind because they were too sick to travel. And then when they got to Sunbury, Georgia, and we should say that Lee wanted to take them all the way to St. Augustine, Florida, which was a Tory haven. They were going to attack St. Augustine. They never made it. When they got to Sunbury, Willie Moultrie was with them. So there were South Carolina troops, North Carolina troops with him. He said that of amongst all of these guys, about 15 men a day were dying from malaria.
Wow.
So if you look at the muster rolls for the 8th, you'll see that entire companies were wiped out. If you were from if you grew up along in the Carolinas or along the seaboard, you might have a bit of a resistance to malaria. But if you're from Hampshire County, West Virginia, or Berkeley County or the Shenandoah Valley, you have no resistance.
Right.
So the companies from Pittsburgh, well, one company from Pittsburgh because one didn't make it. The company from Berkeley County, William Dark's company, the company from Fincastle County, which is now basically Kentucky, they were just wiped out. I mean, like a handful of guys survived. It was very deadly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so when he gets back, Muhlenberg gets back to Virginia, to Woodstock, I think around December, mid-December, late December, and he writes that his unit is shattered. And the rest of them come back in January. And I mean, at that point, it's starting not to be his problem anymore because he's about to be promoted to brigadier general. But you're absolutely right, the 8th Virginia, which, by the way, he writes, now I'm assuming this was the way it was when they went down there, but he also, he writes a letter saying he'd like to see the 8th Virginia armed with muskets, because right now they all had rifles.
Yeah.
Boy, oh boy, did my antenna go up when I read that, because I'd always heard about, the 11th Virginia, which, by the way, I don't believe was all rifles. I think they were mostly rifles. 8th Virginia apparently was all rifles, simply because of where they came from again, I think.
Yeah.
He got one letter that said that.
And there's evidence that continued. William Dark, who was a captain from Berkeley County, who after Peter Helfenstein died or resigned because he was dying, should have become the major. Your guy, Richard Campbell, got the promotion instead, although that was later.
He knew the right person. He knew General Lee,
I think Dark was sick and left behind in Charleston.
Probably. That makes sense.
Yeah. But when that fight is happening over the promotion controversy, they're back up in the Philadelphia campaign. And Dark gets detached in New Jersey in the spring before the Battle of Short Hills, evidently to lead riflemen alongside Daniel Morgan.
Oh, okay. Okay.
As Howe was leaving the state, it's Dark and Daniel Morgan doing it.
Yeah.
Right? I think they've all got. I think they have rifles. And then when Maxwell's light infantry is formed, right, as a light infantry force, by that time in the war, light infantry usually I think means muskets as opposed to like Morgan's rifles.
Right.
But I think Dark's guys probably still had, early in the war, it clearly meant, at least in Virginia, it meant rifles.
Absolutely. It says again in Hennings, it says right there, we will raise 3 companies per regiment of riflemen to serve as light infantry.
Yeah, exactly. But Dark, I think, is leading riflemen detached from the 8th, well into 1777.
Did any of was Dark, I should know this, did any of the 8th Virginia serve in Morgan's Rifle Corps and make it to Saratoga?
Yeah, not many, but James Knox, the captain from Fincastle County.
Yes.
Now, like all of Southwest Virginia into Kentucky.
Absolutely, I know that name.
He was a pre-war long hunter, like Daniel Boone, right?
Yep.
And he formed a company, one of the original companies. They were almost all wiped out by malaria. But when they got back to New Jersey, he and his, I think the lieutenant and the ensign, one of the lieutenants, I think one of his other lieutenants was gone. They all got detached to Morgan's rifles. Okay,
I was always unclear. I never was able to find, firm evidence that they went per company, because the orders say select the men based on their ability, and it sounds like it's an individual selection. So
I think that's right, and they were all detached. Like Morgan's rifles, all of those guys were officially still members of their home regiments, just detached temporarily with Morgan. So you'll never find a muster roll of Morgan's rifles, as I understand it. Which is
no, that's not true. I've got them. I'm in my rifleman book. The National Park had assembled one. It's in the back there, and that's where
I don't see that.
Yeah, I just have the transcription, so I don't know the original source. I think was just copied. It's up in Saratoga. Eric Schnitzer would be the man that would be able to help you out there in Saratoga.
All right. Well, not to belabor this with our viewers, but I'm going to email you about that.
Okay.
I'm eager to see that.
How many 8th Virginia guys are still, are around by after all these guys are dying down in South Carolina and Georgia, and are there hundreds of them still, or or do they have to replenish throughout? And at some point, they end up redesignating a lot of these units.
Later. That's not until after Monmouth.
Yeah. Okay.
78.
Yeah. So when they get back, in the spring of 77, Muhlenberg gets promoted to general. Abraham Bowman becomes the colonel, and they go to New Jersey to rendezvous with the main army. Richard Campbell, who was the major, but shouldn't have been, he gets sent back to the Shenandoah Valley to recruit because they're severely depleted. And Robert Higgins is a new captain appointed by Washington to form an entirely new company because one of the companies was gone for reasons I won't get into. And he spent months trying to recruit a new company. And after several months, he'd only recruited 20 guys.
Yeah. That was getting hard in 77.
And
Morgan had this.
And they joined the army right before Germantown, and they all got captured.
Daniel Morgan had the exact same problem coming back as a hero from Quebec. He gets captured in 75, held prisoner all that time, comes back to Virginia in the fall of 76, winter of 76, and is trying to recruit. And he's finding out the enthusiasm's gone by 77. So it's much harder to fill those positions up. Yeah.
And I don't think it ever got easy after that. I mean, your piece on the 18 months men from last year, whatever that was, that's case in point. I mean, they basically just had to draft people after a while.
Yeah.
So
Muhlenberg gets promoted to general, and then how does that go for him?
Well, he serves. He's put in General Green's division. Make sure I got this right. Green and Wheaton, yeah. Muhlenberg and Wheaton and Green. So he's gonna be at the Battle of Brandywine. He's gonna be at the Battle of Germantown. He's gonna be at Valley Forge. The thing that really jumps out, though, is the rank controversy. What had happened is when Virginia started naming new brigadiers, you remember it was George Washington goes off. He's the commander in chief. The first brigadier general, I think, was Andrew Lewis, I think. Yeah. And then Hugh Mercer gets named. Yeah. And then Hugh Mercer gets named, and Mercer's the commander of the 3rd Virginia. And then Adam Stevens gets named. Well, the problem is there's a guy named William Woodford who'd already been a hero at Great Bridge, and he was getting passed over. He fell. It was mostly because of French and Indian War experience, but still, Woodford was mad about that. He thought, he recognized that Mercer was essentially a more experienced general, so that one wasn't the one that pushed him over the edge. But when Adam Stevens got promoted ahead of him, he lost it, and he resigned. And there's a great letter where Washington says, don't do it, you're going to regret it. And sure enough, because then Congress names 4 more brigadier generals, and Woodford is the 4th one they named. It's Muhlenberg, Wheaton. Well, it's Muhlenberg, Wheaton, and then Scott is he's added a little bit later. Right. Muhlenberg, Wheaton, and then Woodford. So Woodford now has blown it. He should have been the next one in line, but now he's behind. So he kind of whines about it, and his allies. He's got a good friend, Edmund Pendleton, and they kind of do this little campaign to reorder it, and eventually they do. The Congress eventually reshuffles. So Muhlenberg goes from number of the current brigadiers in 77. Muhlenberg goes from number 1. I think he slides down to number 2. I don't know, because then there's Scott gets bumped up there. But all this nagging and whining, and Wheaton ends up resigning, and Scott becomes kind of a non-factor because then he gets shipped down to. He never comes back to the army after he goes to Virginia in 79, and then he gets captured at Charlestown, and then so does Woodford too. But there's just a lot of tension over rank in 78, 79. And then it all gets settled by Charleston in 80.
So the most of the Virginia line's going to go down to Charlestown, but Muhlenberg doesn't go.
Nope, Muhlenberg refuses to go. In fact, I kind of respect him for this because he writes, a couple of times to Washington that honor is requiring him to resign. But I understand that you're also in dire straits for officers, so I'll pick a better time. So he never pulls the trigger. He never actually quits the way Whedon quits and walks away, which was not a cool thing. So Muhlenberg sticks in there, and at the end, when the whole Virginia line's ordered down, Muhlenberg's kind of like, I am not going south under that man, you know. And so they come up with this arrangement. Well, why don't you just hang out in Virginia and help recruit and send more troops down? And it worked itself out, because then the Virginia line shows up. You know the story, Mark. Shows up in April and is captured in May with everybody else.
Right in there, yeah. Again, marching overland and down to South Carolina, and
yeah, at least a little bit cooler, but then there's winter conditions, so a lot of times they didn't have tents.
Yeah.
And who wants a tent in the winter anyway?
Campaign, I think that Muhlenberg and George Washington are the only Virginia generals left in the field.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you got some guys like Daniel Morgan, who is, he's suffering from sciatica and raging hemorrhoids, so he can't fight, right?
Oh, you had to mention the hemorrhoids. Oh, no. I always avoid that. That's just one of those things I don't want to have to explain that one. It's true. It's true. You're right.
Yeah.
But and then the fate of those guys who do surrender at Charleston is pretty awful, because a lot of them get thrown on prison ships out in Charleston Harbor, and
my man Woodford ends up getting sick and dies.
Yeah,
and they end up trying to send him. They won't let him go home. They won't parole him. He needs to be paroled. Get out of there. But they send him north to New York too late, and apparently he's buried in Trinity Church, I think, right the shadow of the World Trade Center. Freedom Tower, I think now.
Yep. That's where Alexander Hamilton's buried there too. So
yeah.
But they but yeah, so a lot of these guys, and then the whole time the British are giving, all these private soldiers the opportunity to take the King's shilling to, it's amazing that those who decided not to take that and rather stuck it out in the prison ships, which, was probably a fate worse than death, and death for many of them. But so Muhlenberg avoids that travesty and is then involved in the campaign there in Virginia.
Yes, he has almost like a second chapter or another chapter all to himself, and that's he's here. They try to sort out. They don't have much to work with of the Virginia line. There are some remnants of it. Of course, a lot of them get wiped out at the Waxhaws. So they try to pick up the pieces, and in the summer of 80. The Virginia Assembly comes up with a 18-month essential service plan. They try to raise 3,000 men to meet their continental quota, which is I think the quota was 5,000. But in any case, they're trying to assemble them at Chesterfield Courthouse and all. And Muhlenberg's kind of dealing with that and traveling around the state at different places, trying to recruit. And it gets essentially, you've got that little diversionary raid there. It doesn't go very well. Was it the Leslie raid in the fall of 80, that kind of alarms the state? But the real big thing is Arnold. When starting in January all the way to Yorktown, there's a lot that happens in Virginia, and Muhlenberg is involved with almost all of it. I mean, he actually gets to go home in late December, to go home to Woodstock and see his family, which he has not seen his family that often, very much, compared to a lot of other officers who could take furloughs all the time. And then all of a sudden, literally gets there, and 2 days later, an urgent dispatch shows up saying, "I need you back," from Steuben. Steuben's now the overall commander here in Virginia. "I need you back. British forces sailed up the James." So he turns around and starts making his way, and he ends up at Cabin Point. Now, he's a continental officer. This is something that a lot of people have always misunderstood. They thought he did like what Whedon did and left, but he hasn't left. He's a continental officer. But most of the continental soldiers that are in Virginia, in the hundreds, there aren't that many, are either being shipped down or sent down when they're ready to reinforce Nathaniel Greene. And then the remnants who are not ready are being held in the cabins there at Chesterfield Courthouse. So he doesn't have a lot of continentals to work with, so he commands militia. And so when Arnold does his raid up the river and burns part of Richmond down, and then goes back down and ends up in Portsmouth, then Muhlenberg is essentially the man on the spot. He's not the overall commander, he's second in command, but he's kind of in charge of everybody south of the James, all the American forces south of the James. So he ends up spending a lot of time in the Suffolk area. And a bunch of us in the 7th did a lot of kind of touring of that area, because we look at the maps and we're like, I don't understand. Why didn't he just go from Portsmouth to Suffolk is like 25 miles. But we forget that we build bridges and we drain swamps. And so we build straight roads, and they didn't. They got to go around some of these things. And so it starts to make much more sense. So he's there all spring, all winter into the spring. And then you know the rest of the story. Then reinforcements of the British show up. Lafayette actually was hoping he was going to be able to bag Arnold in Portsmouth. But British Navy shows up and protects them, and then reinforcements. So they sail up the river again in April, and there's a battle at Petersburg. Now, Petersburg is an amazing story in the sense that it's essentially a David versus Goliath. And Muhlenberg, I think, is the man who is on the field, commanding. We didn't win the battle, but we definitely didn't turn and run. It's 2,500 versus 1,000, 2,500 Brits versus 1,000 militia. Now, I think some of those troops are pretty well experienced troops, though. I mean, they have a lot of experience, and there's more to the story out there down the road to dig into. But after Petersburg, then I think Lafayette comes and takes over, with his reinforcements, the light infantry. And Muhlenberg ends up, and it gets complicated when Anthony Wayne shows up too with the Pennsylvanians. There's, a lot of switching of responsibilities between these generals now. And Muhlenberg ends up being essentially in command of light infantry, Continental light infantry, the light infantry that Lafayette actually brought down. Okay, so he doesn't really participate in battles of Spencer's Ordinary or Green Spring. That's all the Pennsylvanians had been detached. So Muhlenberg's back with Lafayette with the main force. And then, of course, we kind of work our way to Yorktown, and Muhlenberg's in command of the light infantry even at Yorktown. I mean, those were his troops, technically speaking, that stormed the redoubts. I guess it would have been 10, the American troops that, Alexander Hamilton gets all the credit for, and rightly so. I mean, he did lead the charge, but it was Muhlenberg's, he was the commander of the light infantry. All right, I've rattled on and on, but you get the point.
Let me say something about Yorktown. So Henry A. Muhlenberg, who, the great nephew who wrote the first biography, he actually makes a big issue of this at Yorktown, right?
Yeah.
Near the end of his book. So, and I've thought about this, and I think, Hamilton gets credit for having led the troops that stormed the redoubt, right? And Henry A. Muhlenberg claims that Hamilton's friends had essentially stolen credit for this from Muhlenberg, who he says actually led. Well, the word lead has two meanings, right?
Right,
so
right.
Hamilton went first, like he led as in he went in front, but lead also means to be in charge, right? And Muhlenberg was in charge.
Yeah, yeah.
So both are sort of true. And then the great nephew, the biographer, also says that because Hamilton died, nobody wanted to sort of take credit away from it, right? So the myth was perpetuated. So this is an interesting point.
I was surprised at that too, and I read it as Muhlenberg was essentially in the main body that followed the shock troops.
Yes.
So he was right there.
He was wounded. He was wounded.
So too, yeah.
So Hamilton wrote the report because Muhlenberg was wounded, and so Washington gets the news from Hamilton, so he gets the credit.
Yeah, because Muhlenberg's also not feeling. He ends up getting sick around the same time period too. So,
well, he had malaria. He died from the symptoms of malaria years later. So he was probably having a relapse of malaria.
Right, because he ends up right after Yorktown. I mean, it was even questionable to me whether he was there for the surrender. It was unclear if he actually was there for the ceremony, but I know he goes to Woodstock, immediately after it's all wrapped up.
Well, he's in the painting anyway.
Well, I think Muhlenberg's post-war career is also interesting, at least politically speaking, because he, after the war, he's a big anti-federalist, which is interesting because it seems like a lot of the men who fought tended to side with the Federalist camp with Washington. So I thought that was kind of interesting from his post-war years.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So he's in the first Congress, right? So after the Constitution is ratified, he is elected to the House of Representatives in the first Congress, as is his brother. His brother was the first Speaker of the House, right? And his brother was a Federalist, right? And Peter's an anti-Federalist. And they both voted on the Bill of Rights, right? They both voted to create the U.S. patent system. I mean, all of these amazing things that happened in the first Congress, he's there for it, right? And I actually don't remember what the compromise was, but there was some major controversy that his brother Frederick, the Speaker, sort of flipped his vote on, sort of for the sake of national unity. I don't remember what the issue was, but there was definitely some very dramatic politics going on at that time and between the two of them.
Now,
and
Tom.
I was just going to ask, he went to he was representing Pennsylvania.
Yeah. After the war, once it's all done, he stays to the end. He ends up being a major general. They essentially promoted. They gave everybody one more rank above where they were at the end of the war. So he was a brigadier general. They made him major general when he retired, or when it was all done. But he writes that he couldn't return after 7 years, almost 8 years in the army. He couldn't return to the pulpit. Just couldn't do it. So he walks away from that. And I found this really cool kind of reference from him, where he goes and of course he gets land like all the other officers and all that. He goes out there to check out the land grants that he's received and all. And he talks about how, just try to picture this. He's hanging out in a tavern as he's heading out into the frontier, and he hears his name being bandied about by people in this tavern. They're talking about General Muhlenberg, right? And he's sitting there and he says, I have at present the perfect resemblance of Robinson Crusoe, which probably means a beard and all that. 4 belts around me, 2 brace of pistols, a sword, a rifle slung, besides my pouch tobacco pipe, which is not a small one. Add to this the blackness of my face, which occasions the inhabitants to take me for a traveling Spaniard. But he's wondering if they would be saying what they're saying if they knew he was Muhlenberg. But he's sitting there right there just listening to him and kind of spout off. Some are saying compliments and others are not so complimentary. So, he went out there, he had this little episode of frontierism, I guess, just to check out what he received. But you're right, he ends up in Congress and back to Pennsylvania.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I mean, and Mike's talking about frontierism, and I think a lot. What happens to a lot of these 8th Virginia guys follow war, because most of them are going to go west.
No, that's exactly right. Let me say one more thing about Muhlenberg first, though. He was a very big deal in Pennsylvania, right? So he was under the Revolutionary Constitution of Pennsylvania. There was no governor. There was a plural executive. There was a council, and Ben Franklin was the chairman or the president of the council, and Peter Muhlenberg was the vice president. And this is in Franklin's last years, and he's not very well. So Muhlenberg was the de facto governor of Pennsylvania.
I'm sitting here amazed. I should know this, but I got my interest just shrinks after the war.
Oh yeah, but this is
I'm guilty of that. But
that's years later. But if you look at sort of official Pennsylvania documents that are signed in the I'm trying to remember exactly what time period, but it might even be like 1785, 86-ish. They're signed by Peter Muhlenberg as if he's like the governor, right? So he was a very big deal. And then he was elected to the House, and then I think he served 3 non-consecutive terms. So
and briefly to the Senate.
First, third, and fifth Congresses, something like that.
Right.
And then he was elected to the Senate.
Yeah.
So he was a very big deal.
But he resigned. He resigned from the Senate to take a government job, like an inspector. Yeah. And that's what he was doing at the end. He was at 61. He passed away. 1806.
Right. So Jefferson gets elected president, And so all the anti-federalists start to get patronage jobs. And
there you go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But so Mark, to answer your question about, these guys. So, if you were from, Tidewater, Virginia, and you fought in the Revolution, you probably stayed home after the war. I don't know so much about those guys, but if you were from the Shenandoah Valley, or you were from Fort Pitt, or you were from Fincastle County, which is now, the extreme southwestern Virginia and Kentucky, your purpose for fighting the war was to gain the right to go west. Right. In 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, the king draws a line down the Allegheny Mountains saying nobody's allowed to go further than that because it was too expensive to fight Indians. Well, we just fought a war so we could do that. Right. They were furious.
Sure.
And so for these guys who were terrified of Indians, there's been a slow burn Indian war going on since 1754. Right. These guys are in the war for the right to fight Indians and go west. So when the war is over, in fact, before the war is over, these guys start to go west. And there are two ways to go, right? You can't really cart a wagon over the Allegheny Mountains. You can either go up to Pittsburgh and float down the river, or you can go down to the Cumberland Gap and through and then take the Wilderness Road into Kentucky. So, these guys just start streaming west. And Peter Muhlenberg's Robinson Crusoe trip is part of that, right? He's got land in Kentucky that he got for his service.
Thousands of acres. He's
got to be, incognito to go because he's a celebrity. But he goes to Pittsburgh and then floats down the river.
Yep.
He gets to, I don't know where he stops, but he actually makes a point of going to outside Lexington to find Abraham Bowman, who was his lieutenant colonel in the 8th. And they visit for a few days, right? And this big reunion between these two guys. Muhlenberg gets sick. Again, it's probably a relapse of his malaria, which lives in your liver forever until it kills you. Finally, he heads off towards the Cumberland Gap and goes home that way. And Bowman gives him, some bacon and a salted ham to keep him fed on his way. Oh, it's a buffalo tongue, I think, to eat on his way home. But there are tons of these guys, right? I've got a piece up on my blog about Joseph Carman, who took his family to Kentucky, and one day out on a buffalo hunt, he and his two companions get ambushed by Indians. And one of the other guys gets his finger blown off, and they run away, and he's left, and he's captured, and he's tortured and scalped and murdered. And they spend a few days trying to find his body, and they find body parts strung up in the bushes.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
It was a brutal existence out there. And James Knox, the guy that went into Morgan's Rifles, he went to Kentucky. He ended up, I think, part of the Kentucky Constitutional Convention, and before that, he was a delegate to the Virginia legislature when Kentucky was still part of Virginia. There are countless stories like that. Jonathan Clark, who we talked about very early in the hour, he was George Rogers Clark's older brother, William Clark's older brother. He went to Louisville. The whole family went to Louisville. It was a land of opportunity, and they had fought the war largely to do that. I don't think they cared about tea and taxes.
Right.
We're talking about in Boston. They wanted to go west, and they did.
Land was the one asset the Continental Congress had, or Virginia for that matter, had to entice these guys to sign on, to stay on.
Exactly right. And a lot of them died when they got there, but they went.
And I think remembering the 8th Virginia and Muhlenberg, a big part was, the idea of these Germans. I think later generations, as more Germans immigrated to the United States, they were looking for German American heroes. Well, and I think that's, why I glommed onto Muhlenberg.
You said something about a new memorial in an email. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, so actually that's how me and Gabe first met, actually. So a couple of years ago, a friend of mine from college is the town planner for the town of Woodstock. Woodstock is working right now and to develop a section in the square there to be a park, but they want to turn it into kind of a living memorial.
Good. I've seen the statue that's there, and I mean the site of his church, which is an actual Episcopalian church now, I think, and then the courthouse, not the original courthouse, but where the museum is. That's cool.
Like I mentioned at the beginning, there's a bust and there's a statue to Peter Muhlenberg.
Yeah.
But the idea was to incorporate some sort of living memorial to the members of the 8th Virginia. And so they're still in the process of developing it, but from the early conceptual plans, it looks pretty cool. It's gonna, it's gonna be like 8 trees for the 8th Virginia. They're gonna use plants and stuff like that from different battlefields that the 8th Virginia fought.
They might want to add of the Continental Line after that to avoid any misidentification.
Yeah, nothing to tear down.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, and as Gabe was talking about how a lot of them went west, there will be like in-ground lights that kind of go towards the west with like a water feature and stuff like that. So there's some planning going into create some sort of community space that the town can also use as a memorial, to the which looking at memorialization of the whole, what everybody's talking about now, every little town having a memorial to the Confederate soldiers. There was no real memorialization process like that for all of these little towns who had guys who went off to go fight during the Revolution. And that the memorialization really after the Revolution was, Muhlenberg and holding up heroes who are generals or, allegoric figures, Liberty, Columbia.
Right.
Passed over, but now looking back on it, you look at all these guys who traveled all over, sacrificed, died, and ultimately won our independence. There should be some sort of recognition for them. So there's not really a precedent for this kind of thing, but it would be nice to have it remembered in some way there in Woodstock, which, as Gabe says, is not the be all and end all of 8th Virginia, but certainly it was a well known for its associations with the 8th.
Sure. Yeah. Nice little town.
Soul.
Yeah.
What Woodstock needs, Mike, is a Richard Campbell statue.
Yeah.
It started on that.
Yeah.
Peter Muhlenberg statues. How about one Richard Campbell statue?
Absolutely. I mean, I've got this thing. If you give your life for your country and a cause, you should deserve that recognition. I agree. That's probably, I kept coming across Campbell's name and all the stuff in the South, the Green Campaign and all that. I'm like, okay, I need to know more about this guy. What's going on? Who is this guy? Because you get him mixed up too. There's so many Campbells,
Yeah. But he's dead in an unmarked grave in South Carolina and basically, forgotten. But
Charles Porterfield, the subject of my second book, Lieutenant Colonel. The anniversary of Camden's coming right up.
Yeah.
He didn't die, but he died a few months later from the wound inflicted at Camden. So I agree. Just.
Another reason why a lot of these guys don't get remembered is they all left their homes, right? I mean, probably 10 of these guys moved west after the war. So, they're not buried there. They were gone for the last 40 years of their lives. So
there's not families there afterwards, to mark those things.
That's true.
Yep.
But but in lieu of monuments and memorials at the moment, though, we do have, we can write about these guys so they're not forgotten. But we are a little after 8. But I want to thank both Gabe and Mike for coming on and talking to us tonight. This is great.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll everybody check out Emerging Revolutionary War. We have our symposium, which was supposed to happen in September. Because of COVID, has been postponed, so now it's going to be happening in May. It's happening in Alexandria. We got a bunch of great speakers, myself included. I'll be talking about other Germans, the Hessians, and some of the myths surrounding the Hessians during the 10 Crucial Days campaign. We also got a bunch of other speakers. You can check it out on our website, and you can register starting now at $60 for the symposium. And tune in next week. We'll have another edition of Rev War Revelry. But thank you, everybody, for checking in, and we'll see you next week.
All right.